the director of the Shane Project, of which Charlie is one of our favourite members. The Shane Project is an interdisciplinary, Wellcome Trust funded project, that research project and public engagement project, medical and psychiatric aspects of sexual violence. And even though you're not funded by the Wellcome, I still remembered when you joined us and you just propelled yourself into our community with this great cocktail, and we just knew that you were one of us. So we're really thrilled to be able to launch your book today. I'm afraid I've got some housekeeping, so just bear with me here. Fire safety first. We are not expecting any drills. So if the alarms do go off, could you please just make an orderly exit? But we're not expecting any problems because I think we're the only ones in the building. Second, toilets, ladies, just straight down there on this floor, gentlemen, straight down here, up one flight of stairs. The event is being live streamed by our wonderful meeting owl in front of me here, who occasionally, he thinks, it's a he. I think he thinks that when I'm not sort of paying attention, he goes, ooh, ooh. So if you hear a weird noise, that's what that is. It's being live streamed and recorded, but not the audience. So the only people who will be seeing are us people up here. Welcome also to all those people online. Really thrilled that you can join us today. Both people online and people here today, and today only, you can get a discount if you buy the book. If you buy the book today, you only pay £20. So it's about 20%, it's like more than 20% discount. So please buy the book today. We would really love that, and so would you. And for those of you online, the code is going to be put in the chat, so you can follow it up there. I think that is all of the housekeeping. So let me just say what we're going to do today. I'm going to say what the book is about, just briefly, 5 minutes. We're going to let Charlie talk finally, and she's going to read from the book. Then you and I are going to have a chat about the book for about 20 minutes. Then we're going to throw it open to people in the room and also people online. If you are coming in online, just pop your questions and discussion or points you want to make in the chat. We hope to have time to go through all of them, but if we don't, then we will come back to them in the next few days. But please, as we go, just pop things in the chat if you're interested in asking any questions. But first, let me just, your book, Teenage Dreams. I love the title, I love the cover. Thank you, Rutgers. Girlhood Sexualities in the US Culture Wars. I mean, of course, no one who is presenting someone else's book says, I didn't like the book. But let me just say, I loved this book. I mean, I've heard you speaking about it. You always speak so eloquently and all that. But actually reading it, it was just that, oh my goodness, she's a real intellectual as well. You know, so it was a real joy to me. I mean, it's beautifully written. So thank you very much. And basically, what does the book do? It does what it says on the cover. It reveals the extent to which the sex lives of girls and young women have been central at the really heart of the US culture wars. Welcome everyone, it's coming in. What she does, I mean, what you do right at the very beginning is problematize the very topic that you are exploring. So in particular, of course, problematizing that concept of girls, girlhood, the fluidity and contradictions that are sort of at the really heart of the girl motif. You know, sometimes girls, when they say girls, they mean teenagers, even younger often. Sometimes they actually mean, I couldn't believe this, sort of women in their 30s. You know, so that real shift or in the way the term is used depending on the context. Sometimes it refers to vulnerability. Other times, in fact, exactly the opposite, sort of fears about young women and girls who have too much agency in their lives. Other times, of course, the girls may not themselves identify as girls. So not all girls are cisgender or would identify as such. And I like the way that you do that problematization right at the very start. So prominent themes, these are just the themes I particularly found interesting. Loved your stuff on abstinence only sex education. I mean, this is so central. It's such a big problem in terms of, in terms of women's health, the health of young people, and particularly, as you point out, in times of AIDS, where there's a huge sort of crisis about AIDS, and at the same time, they're having this thing about abstinence-only education, sex education. There's great stuff on porn, always great stuff on porn, but also that real big question: does sexual speech constitute sexual action? Which is at the heart, I think, of that chapter. There's people who've just come in. There's a couple of seats over here, so please just make yourself at home. The HPV vaccine is a really interesting section in the book, and what that tells us about public perceptions of the value of women's bodies or girls' bodies and girls' health. Attempts to resurrect or indeed invent traditional gender roles, not only in the public sphere, but also in private ones, discrimination against historically marginalized sexualities, the shocking treatment in one chapter, which you've got great detail about, of Anita Hill, Jocelyn Elders, Monica Lewinsky, the politics of emergency contraception, and I want to come back perhaps to that when we talk about the medical aspects of your book. And, as you say, the kind of irony that so few adults, even those with otherwise liberal sexual policies, outwardly support teenagers' access to sexual and reproductive health care and frank information. And just how few, even liberal adults, actually support this. So I found that really interesting. But I think the book does much more than just give an in-depth analysis of the intertwined nature of politics and girlhood sexuality. I mean, what you do, Charlie, is you pull back the lens at various times in each chapter to explore exactly what those debates tell us about really broad questions within society and within politics in late 20th and early 21st century America. So the new right's obsession with neoliberalism, privatization, free market, restrictions on government spending, etc., neatly mirroring concerns about teenage pregnancies, funding for sex education, breakdown of traditional families, single moms, welfareism. I really appreciate it because I've read quite a lot, particularly about abstinence only sex education. I really appreciated the way you were careful to avoid simplistic comments, these throwaway comments you often get in the literature, not naming anyone, about evangelical right-wing commentators on the one side and the rest on the other. I mean, you really convincingly argues to me that it was not inevitable that certain political figures would come to argue a particular case. And the great example here that you give about others is about Reagan. The switch from when he was governor of California to when he became president of the United States. But you also show that not all Protestant, even evangelical Protestant communities were socially conservative. This disjoin between the hierarchy and lay members, liberals as well as conservatives, struggling to engage in debates about girlhood sexuality, particularly in the period where there's heightened concern about child sexual abuse. So the way that those debates about child sexual abuse get intertwined into these other debates that you're looking at. And of course, at stake is a vast array of public issues: affirmative action, art, feminism, contraception, homosexuality, multiculturalism, school prayers, and so on, which you really beautifully delineate there. stressed in fact by, the way, the great fear, particularly amongst certain writers and artists who attempt to give good information, true information, gritty information about sex to young girls and the way they are attacked within communities. But these repressive movements that you talk about, accounted, of course, by many other groups, by pro-sex feminists, by socialist feminists, people like Bell Hooks, who, anytime you can mention Bell Hooks, you must mention Bell Hooks. As she put it in Remembering Rapture, just the title of that book is fantastic. We need to seek a world where our souls can speak and unfold. The most powerful, though, of these reflections, and what makes your book unique and really amazing, is every single point you show how these debates are classed and how they are raced or racialized. Fears associating with desegregation really crucial. White parents anxious that Black girls are going to somehow corrupt their children. Young women of color, my favorite chapter is that chapter where you look at the way young women fight against these characterizations and these oppressive things that are being done to them. So, grassroots organizations led by young women of color and other women, where teenage girls and young women advocate for their own sexual safety, their own desires, and their own identities, culminating, of course, the Girlhood Convention. It's a great chapter. In fact, if your time's short, just want to read one chapter, read this chapter, because you get rebellion, you get masturbation, you get obscenity, you get sensible advice, you get DIY, self-expression, queerness, sisterhood, diversity, and empowerment. It's really great chapter. So I'm going to stop now because we want to hear you read, but I think it's a really important book for our times. I don't have to tell anyone in this room here, with current debates about abortion in particular. And indeed, you close the book by referring to, I'm quoting you, the sustained legacy of using the incendiary topic of white young girls' sexuality as a bargaining tool. So in other words, lessons, I think, for all of us today, particularly those of us who are concerned with the lives of young girls and women. But I'm going to turn it over to you because we want to hear you read. Go for it.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Joe. So you're in luck, Joe, because I'm actually going to read from that chapter that you so enjoyed.
I think it's the masturbation bit.
So this reading comes from the introduction of the third chapter of the book, which indeed looks at the movements of girl cultures in the 90s in resistance to the sexual politics of that era. And it looks how these underground movements were co-opted by the mainstream and what happened there. And so it's the chapter is titled Explicit Content, Cultures of Girlhood. As the 1990s unfolded, a new sexual politics dawned in the United States. The new right lost its hold on the executive office as George H.W. Bush failed to secure re-election. Meanwhile, the fervor of the anti-obscenity movement and the moral hand-wringing of the Parents Music Resource Center, which, by the way, is the group that put the parental advisory stickers on music, we have them to thank, gave way to a more explicit sexual culture, albeit one that mostly benefited straight men. Young women played a central role in the shift to a more frank discussion about sexuality in American public life. By the end of the 1990s, the sexual lives of teenage girls were no longer unspeakable. They were a major matter of public debate across multiple platforms, from local underground activist and punk communities to national organizations. While in the 1980s, adults spoke about teenage female sexuality through debates around outcomes such as teenage pregnancy or the issue of parental consent for abortions, the question raised more pointedly in the 1990s was more explicitly behavior-focused and saw adults asking outright whether increased sexual knowledge and experience in young women was a matter for celebration or concern. In this new era, where adolescent sex became more explicitly spoken of, the culture wars concerning the sexual practices of young people would shift yet again. With one side continuing to see sexual imagery and speech as harmful to young people, and a sexual underground emerging, led for the first time by young women themselves, which advocated for sexual self-expression and acknowledgement of sexual and gender diversity in young people, and access to sexual information and education. As in the previous era, the categories of culture war progressives and conservatives weren't always adequate at explaining these divisions in debates over sexuality. Rather, as the category of teenage girl became newly prominent within feminisms and within the wider culture wars, the cultural and political debates of the 1990s became defined by mainstream and underground approaches to adolescent sexuality. Because of the relevance of the debates about sex that happened in the 1980s to the lives of young women coming of age in that epoch, and changing access to technologies that enabled young people to create their own forms of media and communication, teenagers increasingly entered these debates themselves in the 1990s by zine and music making, which shifted the nature of public discourse on adolescent sexuality and the nature of women's movements in America. However, the girl culture that resulted was quickly co-opted and de-radicalized by the mainstream media. Attempts to monetize or more widely circulate this kind of activism, exemplified in the case of Sassy Magazine, which is a magazine started by women in their early 20s to provide sex information to teenagers, that was demonetized and completely gutted by conservative organizations within like a year, were quickly shut down by still powerful conservative organizations. Despite moving into the spotlight of American culture and political debates of this period, teenage girls ultimately still needed to turn to the cultural underground to find honest and informative discourse on adolescent sex. The version of girl culture that was used to sell clothes, music, and TV shows mainly took its cues from the most visible underground girl cultures and centered a white middle-class girlhood, ignoring the young women of color who were extremely active in mobilizing these girl cultures, but were not seen as part of the twin zeitgeists of either girl power or girl in crisis that were circulating in the media, the academy, and policy-making circles during this period. This chapter follows the development of this girl culture from its grassroots, youth-driven beginnings through its movement into mainstream culture and ultimately into academic cultures and neoliberal rhetorics of girlhood. As adolescent sexuality became increasingly important in the development of American feminisms, it would expose the fluidity of culture wars actors when it came to the sexual practices of young people, and the continued concern over the increased sexual and reproductive activity of white teenage girls that had underpinned the modern culture wars since their inception. Thanks.
Glad you chose that chapter. Look, it's a question that a lot of us want to know when we meet an author face to face, and that is, how did you come to write this book? What's the trajectory? I mean, obviously, the topic is so important for us today, but how did you get there, and why?
Well, I think for me, it was a personal as well as an intellectual journey. I grew up in the States, but moved to the UK just before my own teen years started. Thank you. So the differences in kind of US and UK girlhoods has always been, really at the top of my mind. And then when I started working on this project, I was actually only 24, so not that far out of my own teens, and still very much identified with the politics of girlhood, and still do to an extent. So those are the kind of personal reasons that took me there. But then intellectually, I came to this topic through some of my early research on AIDS activism, actually, in the US. And I found a piece of a pamphlet from the group ACT UP that was talking about the firing of Joycelyn Elders, who was the first Black Surgeon General of the US in the Clinton administration, who was fired after making remarks on World AIDS Day that masturbation should be taught as a part of comprehensive sex ed in the age of AIDS. And after this, the right completely rallied against her, and Clinton fired her 2 days later. And it was such a shocking story to me, that mostly shocking that this wasn't very much common knowledge. And it started me kind of to look not only at what else was pernicious about the Clinton administration that we don't typically associate with his sexual politics, and starting to look in either direction historically, I realized that there was a larger question to be answered of, why have Americans been so obsessed with the sex lives of teenagers? Why has it taken up so much space in political debate?
I mean, I'm pleased you mentioned your earlier work on AIDS activism, because one of the members of actually our project, the Shame Project, also works on that in the British context. So if anyone is interested in AIDS activism, there's things on our website about that as well. But look, in this book, you make a really strong statement that girlhood sexualities are at the heart of the US culture wars. I mean, that's a big statement to make. What do you mean by that, and how do you justify that statement?
Yeah, so first of all, I'll just define the culture wars a little bit, or what I mean by it, because it's a confusing term, because first of all, we could describe the entirety of US history as a settler colony, as a series of culture wars. And so I guess as historians, we try and periodize that a little bit. And for the purposes of this work, I was thinking of the culture wars in their most recent iteration, which starts around the kind of mid-20th century and the wake of the desegregation of schools in the South. And the lines of the culture wars as they are today were very much kind of drawn in that moment. But when I looked more closely at some of the reactions, you see that the voices that were against desegregation did not just come from white Southern anti-desegregationists. They were coming from more, ostensibly progressive circles. And the uniting idea, the kind of racist idea that a lot of different political actors were perpetuating was that, you mentioned in your introduction, the idea that white girls would be corrupted from their exposure to young people of color in the educational setting. So if you fast forward to where my book starts to look at in the 1980s, those kinds of statements were not as acceptable in the mainstream context, but they were very thinly covered in more covert culture wars over topics like teenage pregnancy, sex education, obscenity, and exposure to sexual information. And I kind of trace in the book how those culture wars, shift over this period and become more and more overt and explicit. And I don't think, many would disagree today that, these conversations are being had more explicitly than ever again. Any kind of premise of kind of covertness is gone. But that's how I trace the importance of the fact that in all of these conversations, you can trace back the concern or the need to protect teenagers to a racialized need to protect white teenagers that comes from that era of the culture wars.
So, I mean, one of the things I found really interesting in your book is, and I mentioned this briefly in my introduction, that is, you're not into simplistic sort of black and white type stuff and, this is wrong, this is right. But you do make an argument that the left progressive forces somehow complicit, if not worse than that. Can you talk us through that argument?
Well, I think in addition to the kind of low-hanging fruit of how bad the conservative right are for young people, I also look at how I try and explain the rise of the right a little bit in this book, or add to that conversation by showing how a fringe group of far-right thinkers doesn't achieve the kind of mobilization they've had today without socially conservative sentiments far outside of the right. And so I try and trace where those sentiments come up. And in the book, I think you can kind of break it down into looking at governmental progressives who, like Clinton is probably the best example of this. What I found in the research is that Clinton brought in the most stringent welfare reforms and abstinence education policies that had been seen at that point in US history, advancing what Reagan had put in by tens of millions, and really opening the door for what George W. Bush did was actually just some small amendments to what Clinton had brought in. And the question of why is often really interesting. So I think for Clinton, it was about covering his own tracks a little bit and trying to perform social conservatism, social propriety to the right, but also he just didn't care. He cared about balancing the budget. He cared about foreign policy. And so it was easy to choose that area of policymaking to, make a stop to the right and say, but also it was successful in the past, not only because it was a stop to the right, but because there's far wider support for reactionary restrictive measures to adolescent sexual and reproductive health than there are, if you take, for instance, a position on abortion, most adults actually want some kind of protection for abortion in the US, but even in the kind of liberal thinkers of that, they might have a different feeling about people under 18. So there's that base of support. But then also, if you look at the non-governmental left in this story, there's still a resistance there to talk about sexual autonomy of teenagers in public. So in the 1990s, the sex education battles were really raging in the wake of Clinton's policy, but even the sex ed advocates, who dedicated their lives to running organizations for sex education, they advocated for comprehensive sex ed, but they still said, we want to teach abstinence as well. We want to teach waiting till marriage as well. We want to promote marriage as well. And so it was kind of always these caveats, which led a young woman called Leslie Cantor, who was working at the Sexuality Information and Education Council at the time, to come out and say, there's no such thing as left-wing sex ed in America. That was the strength of that statement, because, being more generous to those people, you could say it was very, very hard to speak out. There was real material harm, harm to life even from naming some of these sexualities in public, but also, as I say, a less generous read is that I think a lot of the white leaders of some of these organizations had unchecked racialized assumptions about the need for delay and what that meant, and what teenagers they were really talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the Shame Project, what makes us sort of unique in terms of research groups who focus on sexual violence, is that we have this really strong focus on medical and psychiatric. And I mean, you mentioned just a minute ago, reproductive health is really at the heart of the book, and you've got some devastating things to say about the impact of this legislation on young people. Can you say something a bit more about those medical aspects? I'm thinking in particular, your great section on vaccines and those sorts of issues.
Sure. So, well, first of all, I just want to say, that it's been wonderful being a part of the Shame Project, and thank you for putting on this event. And I've learned so much about sexual harm and its histories from this group, and been so amazing having this community. So thank you. But in terms of where these themes come up in my own work, well, firstly, the book touches on the history of feminists mobilizing to the medical and therapeutic communities to understand that when dealing with adult clients, the history of trauma in childhood and youth, and there were real, material changes in the way that diagnostics and treatment were conceived around the possibility of that kind of harm. So that history is touched upon in the book. But as well, I look at, what are the other main themes of shame, which is how the medical and psychiatric communities can perpetuate sexual and reproductive harm. And, as you mentioned, one part of the book touches on the history of Gardasil, which is the HPV vaccine. So a vaccine for an STI that can cause some cancers, or some forms of the virus can cause cancers. And, when you first look at this history, you might see the kind of expected people supporting the vaccine. A lot of progressives speaking out about how, oh yes, and you take this vaccine age sort of 12 to 14, I believe. And, the Christian right said, it really doesn't matter about, the possibility of cancer without this vaccine. It's promoting promiscuity. And then, the expected progressives kind of come forward and they write their think pieces about why this is, so important that we take this opportunity to help young people while we can. And so this is kind of expected, but, again, where the history of teenagers, you dig a little bit deeper and you see these unexpected positions arises. I actually found in this research that there was a strong contingent of immigrant rights groups who were very against the vaccine because it was optional uptake for American citizens, but it was mandatory for young immigrants entering the country to have this as one of 5 vaccines. and it was very early stages. And so they were distressed and mobilizing against the fact that, yet again, there's a long, long history of this. The bodies of young Black, brown, and Indigenous women were being experimented on with medicine that wasn't, widely disseminated. And so again, this history shows us that you can't necessarily look at a culture war and understand exactly where people will fall on that issue.
I mean, you're a scholar, you're an intellectual, you're an author, but you're also an activist. And I think a lot of people who are interested in changing the world, want to not only intellectually understand and disseminate that knowledge to other people, but actually to be more hands-on. For people in this room and those people who are listening online, how does that, not tension, because of course they play off each other really nicely, but how does those different roles that you see yourself playing actually work in practice?
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of inextricable for me, because the entire time that I've been kind of formally studying the US, I've been a body at protests and a part of community organizations here in the US when I've lived back over there. But kind of most formatively was when I started research on this project. I was involved with some folks who are here today, actually, in organizing on the university front about how to deal with sexual harm in the campus environment. And I learned so much through those groups, about my own politics around sexual harm and sexual liberation. And so for me, it's hard to think of the book outside of those conversations. Yeah.
I mean, you're an early career researcher. It's not a good time to be in the academy in whatever country you want to look at. Maybe it's slightly better in the States, but your jobs are hard to find. There's cutbacks everywhere. There's short-term contracts. We can all name horrible things that are happening in universities today. It's a difficult time. But you have been really successful. I mean, you've just got a job. This room, as you can tell by the claps and people online who are going to say, tell us what you did right. What advice would you give to another early career scholar who's maybe struggling a bit to finish a PhD or finish a postdoc or get a job?
I think that for me, the two main pieces of advice I would give, first of all, is that you really can't do it alone. It's very much gate kept, and it's very opaque deliberately. And the only way to kind of understand it better is to have friends going through it with you, and who have just crucially kind of mentors who've just gone through it to share that information, because otherwise honestly the gate post moves every single year, and you can't possibly understand it without that intel. So find people you can trust, and if you don't know people yet, then honestly cold call, because most decent folks will be willing to share that information, and look for people whose research and identities speak to you and you can trust what they're telling you. And don't be afraid to reach out, because I think people are willing. The right people you want to be kind of working alongside will share that. And also just people to lend an ear. There's a lot of people in this room, my wonderful friends, my partner, my family, who've listened to me talk about this so much, and sometimes need to vent, and that community is really important. But secondly, I would say have boundaries and limits, because it's a field that will just take and take and take. And I think it was crucial for me knowing what I wouldn't do, and knowing where my limits were, how many hours I'm willing to work, what I'm willing to sacrifice and not. And and then if you get a job, then you take those boundaries with you, and you help your colleagues uphold theirs. And those would be my main thoughts.
I can't speak for other people, but I'm going to go ahead and do so. I mean, I know for a fact, while you've been in the Shame Project, I mean, you're an early career scholar yourself, but you have mentored other scholars in the Shame Project. PhDs and people who are earlier on in their postdoc career. I mean, you've just been incredible in actually performing what you say is needed. So I just wanted to put that on the table, that has just been a remarkable thing, seeing you doing that for other scholars. So it is fantastic. I'm just going to end with one final sort of thing that I'm really curious about, because at the Shame Project, we are all academics, intellectuals, activists. We're all working for a rape-free world, a world where we don't have to talk about sexual harms all the time, like we seem to be doing. The book is optimistic in some ways. It tells a terrible story in many ways. But what do you think is the way forward for those of us who want to create better worlds? That's a big question. Tell us in, well, you got about 3 minutes.
I mean, I guess I couldn't speak to that like so wholly, but I think in terms of what I researched here, in terms of teenagers, in terms of helping teenagers, I've been thinking about this a lot, like as I finished it, like the kind of so what at the end of the book of, how does this help? And I listened to an interview recently with Tavi Gevinson, who runs Rookie magazine, which is a magazine online for and by teenagers. She was 15 when she set it up in 2011, and she's like 25 now, and she was being interviewed, and someone asked her, what do teenagers need? And she said, to be left alone. And I loved that, because I didn't think she meant to be left alone in terms of like resources and care. I think she meant in terms of stop having culture wars about them. All of the stories described in this book are conversations that don't need to be had. They're so leave them out of your politicking, leave them out of spaces where they can't, just stop using kind of flashpoints about teenagers and their sex lives, which come up kind of clockwork every couple years as technologies change, as mores change. So, stop using their sex lives and genders to sell magazines or get viewers for your news network. That would be that. And also listen to teenagers, because there's kind of no excuse not to hear what teenagers are saying anymore. There's TikTok, or there's Instagram, where you post a TikTok if you're over 30, there's Twitter feeds, there's zines online. Like, there's a way, if you want to know what teenagers are asking for, there's a way to find that out. And so I would say listen and provide those resources, whatever resources you have.
I think that deserves a clap. Unfortunately, the time. We've got about just under 20 minutes for discussion, questions. Anyone here in the audience or online? I know if you're online, just pop it in the chat and we'll come to you in a few minutes. There's someone in person here. Do you want to start?
Sure. Thank you for that really brilliant discussion, which I think speaks to just how fantastic Charlie's research is and how generous she is as a scholar. I'm very proud to be here. I was really struck by comments you both made that suggested the kind of expansiveness of girlhood as a signifier. Often it's kind of derogatory use as a label and applied to people, but it's also kind of liberational, kind of, that's not a word, but liberatory, potential when it's reclaimed. And this phrase you used, the politics of girlhood. I wondered if you could just kind of unpack that a little bit more and maybe kind of comment on whether you think it's been influenced, if not formed, by this kind of, the porn use of girls, particularly in this kind of Reagan and Clinton era.
Yeah, thanks so much, Caitlin, for that question. Definitely. I think for me, there's like two sort of prongs of the politics of girlhood that kind of resonate for me. And one is the way that in this story, Riot Grrrl, so the kind of 90s feminist movement, punk musical movement, there were a lot of teenagers in that movement, but there were a lot of the founding members were in their early 20s, kind of up to their 30s. And it was about reclaiming childhoods that had been affected by harm, and youth and adolescents that had been affected by harm. So it's about a reclaiming of a traumatized experience, and also a rejection of women at the same time, a rejection of what was expected of them as they left the youth in terms of like, well, hey, I didn't really have a youth, can I have it now, rather than being whatever you think woman is. So there's that going on, but then there's also there's the sort of theoretical background of queer adolescence, which is specifically about which kind of comes more from like queer theory work about the idea that if you were a queer teenager who wasn't able to live authentically in your youth, then you can just go ahead and take that adolescence whenever it suits you and whenever you come to that realization. And so both of those are, feed their way into the work for sure.
Yes.
As a former American teen girl, I'm curious, you have an interesting perspective on it. What would you say is the difference between being a British or an English teen girl, having lived both, basically?
Yeah, gosh.
All we have is skins to try
Great question. I think in terms of when I was a teen, so like the same sort of period of the book, like the 2000s, I think, that's what parents were was that there was more, well, I'll tell you, actually the personal moment where I thought I might need to like work on this more, research this more, was when I was studying abroad in the US, which is a weird thing to do. But I was in a class on sexual politics, and somebody started talking about the price of birth control, and they started saying, yeah, it sucks when you like find the one that works for your body, but then you can't afford it anymore. And I was like, you have to pay for birth control, and it just blew my mind, because that so there's just like a material difference to living in the UK, or at least it was then. It's not looking great, but at that time, that really the thinking about the monetary barriers to my peers who I thought we have everything in common, and then just realized just this one kind of major germ of thought that so there's, I would say, in terms of access to healthcare, that's kind of it can impact everything else about the rest of your life that has historically been different. And then I think in terms of the conception of whether you're a child or not, I felt that I would like talk to American friends who stayed in the US, and I'd be like, yeah, we're all going to the pub, we were 15, 16, and everyone was completely shocked by this. And I think just the kind of independence that there is more of a societal conception here, I think, of teenagers as more able to live independent lives than there is, not that no one thinks that way in the US, but just societally there's more of a desire to make adolescence childhood rather than early adulthood.
If you're online, please pop something in the chat, but there's someone at the back there.
Amazing. I can't wait to read it, and I'm going to buy it now, so I don't have to. Wink. Yeah, it sounds great, and I've already learned a great deal just in the conversation between you and Joanna. I suppose I have a question, because I'm intrigued by the argument that you're making. I mean, you set out to the story science, girlhood sexuality, but then you found that actually in the process you had the girlhood sexuality perhaps contained the answer, or a big answer to the question of what the fuck happened with grade 19. Like how is that effective, and how much that wasn't actually that useful. And so I guess my question to you, which is a massive question, I imagine you touched on all 6 chapters, is what is the hegemonic common sense upon which girlhood sexuality could pull in A, middle-class liberal whites? Are they concerned about miscegenation? B, Christian middle-class blacks? C, non-Christian middle-class blacks? And then C, what happens to the working class, non-respectable black adults? And then E, what were the surprising groups of teenagers that really sort of fucked even your steam up?
They come up all the time. So the answer is like different for all of these groups, right? I'll try and recall all. I think in terms of middle-class whites, there's a couple things. One I kind of mentioned earlier is the kind of just fear of what will happen materially, because they see what happens to people who speak about adolescent sex. They fear association with that politics. There's I think especially for queer adults, a fear of being seen as creepy for having anything to do or talk about childhood or youth. So there's some of these kind of fears, but then there's also, as you mentioned, you know, fears of miscegenation. There's unchecked racism that comes from those early culture war periods, and there's a dedication to delay and a very like neoliberal order of life cycles that is at every stage inherently about whiteness and middle classness and upholding that, and any kind of girlhood that doesn't that it all starts with the delay of sexual initiation, and starting that too early is like a domino for all the other neoliberal goals that you're kind of respectability that you're supposed to uphold. Religious Black communities, really interesting part of this story, because AIDS and Reagan's shocking lack of a response to it actually really informs where the Black church or like leaders of the Black church in the US are willing to speak about this, because again, because of this like racialized ideas around, you know, the corrupting sexuality of Blackness that was kind of levied against them in the wake of desegregation, there was an absolute commitment in Black churches to abstinence education, to performing, you know, there's a respectability politics that was, you know, the driving organizing factor. But then they watch, you know, these church leaders watch Reagan like let, you know, bodies pile up and they realize that there is a need to change their approach to sex education, and so then Black churches become some of the leading providers of sex education when it's not there. That's like late 80s, early 90s. Yeah. Remind me of one of non-religious, did you say?
Middle class Blacks.
Middle class. So you see a lot of, I mean, in this story, the people who have that embodiment are often like the leaders of organizations. So there's a lot of like, you know, Planned Parenthood, the Sexuality Information Council of the US, like these kind of big advocacy organizations in which middle class Black Americans are kind of leaders in those movements. And actually, I have to say in this story, though it is the middle class Black leaders of these movements who are working with white leaders who are, the white leaders are reticent to talk about sexual autonomy of teenagers, is where you actually see those Black middle class leaders will speak out, and they will be often their face kind of consequences for that, but it's, you see that the stakes are different, and that is so I wouldn't say, you know, all of the people who worked for kind of liberal sex health organizations took this kind of middle ground mainstream approach. Actually, the diversions from that narrative are the Black leaders in those same organizations who frequently in this story refuse that kind of denial.
I think this is a really good example of, you know, it's not a simple tale you're telling.
Yeah.
And you deal so clearly, precisely with these differences in the book. And that's just what I found really refreshing about the whole thing. I think we've got someone online for.
Yeah, we've got one question from Anna in the chat saying, thanks so much for your talk. It's really illuminating. You focused on the US, and she wondered whether any of these concerns can be directly transposed to the global South.
I mean, definitely not like directly transposed, because this is, you know, like and I would be hesitant to do that kind of lens shift, but definitely there is, you know, very politicized girlhoods and, you know, youth experiences, like, you know, under other terminologies, like in many other contexts. And I think, yeah, so absolutely that story is there to be told. There's, you know, people doing that work. But there's also the story of how and it's not gone into as much depth here. I do touch on it, but there is a large story of the US abroad. So there is a story of the US doing its own transposing of those politics, or I should speak to the owl really, onto the global South. So it's, and that's a very, it's a history that's just kind of starting to be uncovered, which is the story of colonial involvement of the US abroad in terms of, you know, controlling teenager sexuality. But that is a huge part of this story that I think deserves its own book. Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes, over there, thank you.
Thank you for that. So I guess my question is, were you, in light of, the historical lens, and were you shocked, and in light of your work, what was your reaction to Roe v. Wade, and how do you think that obviously we all know in the way that it affects, what our work pertains to, but for you, what do you think is, I guess just your take generally on this in light of your work? And also, I guess I have a sub question, which is, I think researchers who are dealing with this kind of difficult material, how do you, obviously the more you know, I guess the more frustrated you become, obviously because you see the structural issues and how difficult it is, especially when people feel like they went backwards. In some ways, how do you then keep that in check for yourself and manage to keep a positive outlook, just to stay sane and able to continue researching? So.
Yeah, barely. Well, to answer the first part of your question, I'm so glad you raised it. I guess I have to say, like, the saddest thing is, like, I was disgusted but not at all shocked. And doing this research shows how every single day since 1973, Roe has been under attack by thousands, if not millions, of people in the courts, local to supreme, in local legislatures, Congress people, grassroots level people outside of abortion clinics. Like, it is always been under attack. So, but in particular, I learned doing this work, it's been under attack constantly, and it's been most successful when it comes to governing teenagers' access to abortions. So in ways that people have maybe been complacent that Roe is there, it's like, well, Roe is there, but actually the new right in the 80s and many groups since then have had success in stopping teenagers' access to abortions. And teenagers already have limited access to abortions because they're mostly dependent, or they don't have their own lift, or they would face, like, risk to their life for admitting that they needed an abortion. So there's already restrictions there. And then yet again, that has been where it's been most successfully for the anti-abortion movement restricted, because they're, like I mentioned earlier, there's a much broader base of support for restricting the sexual and reproductive rights of teenagers than there is kind of adults as a whole. And so one thing, for instance, that really struck me is that a lot of the coverage has been about the fact that it's overturned Roe, which, of course, but it struck me that many people don't know as much about Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which is the second case that was also overturned. And Planned Parenthood v. Casey is not something to blanket celebrate. Yes, so basically it overturned the right of states to need a spousal consent for an abortion, but it maintained that it was constitutional for states to require parental consent or notification for abortion. And that's been there. That's been sitting there since 1992. And no one's been outraged about, people have been outraged about this, but it's not received the kind of coverage. So the fact that, like, every couple of years it gets harder and harder for teenagers to access them, it is, as a lot of these reactionary politics are, a kind of testing ground for how we restrict everybody. And there's been some complacency about what a warning sign that has been. And in terms of how you keep going, I mean, I do think, like, studying activism, apart from, coming back to Hannah's question about, there are definitely a lot of teenage activists on the right, and we're like, dang, like, the youth are not okay. But yeah, there are, like, people who, like, teenagers who, but yeah, they still have a voice. I guess, they're still political, they are politically autonomous in one way, but studying this kind of activism, resistance to reactionary sentiment and policy, and looking at how, young people and people across generations have organized historically with far less at their disposal and far less, like, connectivity. There is hope in the past too, for sure. And, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book, was to connect, youth activists today with their predecessors who are still living. And, I think, my own community and the communities that speak through this history, like, you can't help but feel that, change can happen, and through that direct action.
We've run out of time. Is yours a quick one?
I sure hope so.
Okay, we've run out of time, so very quick,
Oh, yes, of course.
and we have to end on a positive
This
note.
is my former student, so it's
Very close, I love it.
Oh.
You mentioned a few different administrations, Bush, Reagan, and like, which do you think had the most positive and which the most negative impact in this field?
Oh, they all suck.
It's a nice thing to say about Obama.
I mean, in the conclusion, but only because we didn't really get into it. I mean, it's so little, you know, like there's, that he's part of the reason why dogs happened, you know, like, yeah, no, I mean, I think, there's no, but in terms of who's worse, I mean, I think they're all kind of expectedly bad, but I do really go for Clinton's guts in this book because, you know, I feel like there's something particularly nasty about kind of just the way that he personally benefited from sexual liberation whilst screwing over literally everyone else. And the fact that he was, you know, that feminists at the time were understandably so desperate for a star to hitch their wagon to, that feminists consistently supported him publicly because they were so scared of the alternative, that it's like, just keep Clinton. Like, we know he's bad, we know he's racist, we know his welfare reforms were like truly devastating, but, and now he's like had an affair and he's been, you know, really kind of icky about this, and we just, but we need him because what is the alternative? So I think there's something just so, yeah, extra like kind of sneaky about the way that, and the fact that he would just quietly pass things that like absolutely devastated millions whilst being proclaimed as, you know, oh, but at least he's pro-choice, or at least, you know, the very bare minimum. So I guess that's where, yeah, there's just like a particular kind of eagle there.
Charlie, I just think you should have stopped with they all. We have run out of time. It's been a great event. Please, those of you who are here in person, on your seats there's a survey. Could you just pull it out, and there's a box at the back to pop it in. There's those of you online. You'll also have a survey. So please send it to us. We would really appreciate it. Join our mailing list so that you can hear about other events. We would love to see you in future events, both in person and online. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Rutgers for coming today. It's a wonderful press. You've done a great job with the book. It is you know, if you're thinking of publishing, it's a great, great publisher. Come buy the book. Alison will be signing in a few moments from here. Sorry, Charlie. Alison, one day we sign. I know that stick out. Another occasion, I think the book is coming out. Okay, Charlie will be signing here in a few minutes, but also I want to thank people in the Shane team who've really been so important. Behind the scenes, there's Rianne, who's been like tweeting from home. The real Alison, who has done so much to make this event work. Ria, who is now on maternity leave, but who really started this whole process. Cora here has been fantastic. George has really been also helping all along the way, bringing in the wine. We really appreciate your labor. And of course, I just want to finish by saying, Charlie, your book is great, and you gave a wonderful sort of presentation of it here. I think she deserves a round of applause.